Angelicon is a really interesting Rugrats episode because there are quite a lot of new things here. So I can kind of judge this in two ways. One, as an introduction to a lot of new things, but two, as an episode on its own. For example, had this episode aired halfway through the seventh season rather than being the first episode, how would I have felt about it? Would I have felt differently? And honestly, had this been halfway through the season, I think it might have been not the most interesting, but it's okay. It's the first segment of the first episode of the seventh season, and the narrative focuses on Kimmy taking Cynthia to play with, and I've got some thoughts on that I'll share in a moment. And the babies are playing in Chuckie and Kimmy's new treehouse. And this turns into their imaginative play as Angelica goes after them to try and get Cynthia back. And once we entered their imagination, I kind of lost interest a bit. It's not necessarily the fault of the episode, I just personally tend to not favour the episodes that focus on their imagination and, their imaginary world. So there's nothing specifically wrong with that part of it, it's just not to my liking. However, because this is the first episode with Kimmy, there are several other new things too that I'll talk about, I was, quite fascinated and it kept me sustained. So being the first episode, not too bad. Had it occurred later on, I might not have liked it quite as much. So, first of all, we have the new intro. And I'd actually forgotten about this intro, and then I watched it, and yeah, it came back to me. We have Dill and Kimmy, of course, in this new intro, and it just occurred to me that Dill hadn't been in the intro for the previous season, which was a bit strange. I wonder if they'd kind of knew they were going to bring in Kimmy after Rugrats in Paris and kind of postponed creating that new intro until they had Kimmy, or if it was just at the right time. But I like it. It's definitely an improvement on the intro, but the intro, the classic intro, will always be the one that's the most nostalgic for me, but the animation quality is sharper and it is a lot more delightful. So pros and cons, it's not as nostalgic, but the quality is better. It made perfect sense that this took place at Chuckie's house. Of course, that's Chuckie and Kimmy's house now, and I don't know if I'll ever refer to it as Chuckie and Kimmy's house or if it will always be Chuckie's house. But even in this episode, Chuckie refers to, I think, the backyard as his backyard, and Kimmy points out, no, it's our backyard. But of course, having it there meant that we had the introduction to Kimmy and Kimmy's mother and Fifi the dog. Obviously, if you've seen Rugrats in Paris, these are not new introductions, but in terms of the TV series, these are the first times the characters have been introduced. And it doesn't really introduce the characters, to be perfectly honest. If you haven't seen Rugrats in Paris, you don't know who Kimmy is or how her father met how Chuckie's father met her mother. The introduction isn't very good. So it does kind of rely on some knowledge from Rugrats in Paris. But I feel like most people will have seen Rugrats in Paris if they care enough to be concerned about these introductions. The treehouse design I absolutely loved. I thought it looked brilliant. I was really pleased that Phil and Lil were in this one. Part of me was concerned that Phil and Lil might take a back seat with Kimmy, because that's a lot of babies to animate. We started off with Tommy, Chuckie, Phil and Lil, and now we have 2 extra characters 7 seasons down the line. That's a lot of characters to animate when you have them all on the screen, but I was really pleased to see that they kept Phil and Lil in this. What I also found to be quite fun was when Kimmy went up to Cynthia and she got excited about having a new dolly to play with, and it's going to be interesting, I think, having another girl character who's actually quite girly. Because compared to the others, Lil is quite girly, but she's not as girly as Kimmy seems to be. So I'm keen to see how she's going to fit in with the dynamic. For example, I don't think Lil would ever have suggested playing, I don't know what's traditionally girly, tea parties. That's something that TV shows often show little girl characters doing. I don't think she ever would have suggested that unless they were having, mud pies or something. Whereas Kimmy, I can see suggesting that. So I'm keen to see how she fits in with a lot of their games, because she seems to be different to the others. But then again, Chuckie's different to the others and he fits in well. So we'll see. As an episode on its own, it's okay. Had it appeared in later down the season or in a future season once Kimmy had already been established, probably wouldn't have been as interesting. But to start off season 7, it's definitely not too bad. This is also the first season where we get 3 segments, up to 3 segments in an episode. So that's going to be interesting as well. But hey, more content for me, I guess. Yeah, Angelicon isn't perfect, but it's definitely fascinating.